UL wire options that surpass industry standards webinar. My name is Ryan Wood, Content Marketing Manager here at Epec. Before we get started, I just want to let you all know that you'll be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions as we move along, please enter them in the questions panel, which is located in the webinar control panel, and we'll try to get to them, all of them at the end of the presentation. If we don't have time to go through all of your questions, we will be sure to reply to you by email. Also, we will be recording this webinar and posting both the recording and slides on our website and YouTube channel. Our presenter today is Stephen Goodman, our User Interface and Cable Assembly Product Manager. Stephen is a mechanical engineer with a Bachelor of Science and an MBA from Northeastern. As the User Interface and Cable Assembly Product Manager here at Epec, Stephen works closely with customers to provide solutions to specific problems during design consultation, and where needed, helps with the creation of specific designs. So without further ado, I will pass it on over to Stephen.
Thank you, Ryan. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Steve Goodman. I'm one of the product managers here with Epec. Today, we'll be talking a bit about UL wire and how our options that we have either meet or surpass industry standards. So jumping right into this, we'll be discussing the specific UL requirements for bulk wire and how they apply to both the manufacturing, the design, and eventually the certification of this wire. We'll be diving into the details of how this wire is manufactured. We'll also be discussing various options that we have for the UL rated wire that we can produce. We'll also be discussing design options for both UL approved and non-UL approved designs. And there's some benefits and drawbacks to using non-UL wire. We can dive into those further here. And then lastly, we'll touch on the steps we need to get started with your custom build. So what do we mean by UL requirements for bulk wire? So taking a step back, here at Epec, we support a variety of custom cable assemblies and discrete wire harnesses. These range from your traditional hookup wires to large gauge wires in grounding terminals, overmolded cables, all the way through the variety of D-sub and other types of power and data interconnects. But by and large, all of these types of cables and wire harnesses may or may not have wire that has that UL rating already. This material that we produce here, the UL wire, it's produced on the same exact equipment as all the other types of wire we make. And this is both the bulk wire that we extrude, as well as when it's finished and we use it in the completed cable assemblies. In order to produce these custom cable assemblies, we use a variety of automated equipment that ranges from automated wire strippers to crimp and termination equipment, as well as to the fully automated electrical test equipment, data acquisition systems, and such. But all of this type of equipment is used both on our traditional UL wire as well as our non-UL wire. So touching more about the specifics of the actual UL wire that we can produce here, it covers a variety of different UL ratings that are both for single conductor and multi-conductor cables. And what we mean by that, the single conductors, it's literally a single wire with one insulated jacket on that wire. Those typically have a UL number that starts with UL1 and then 3 numbers or sometimes 4 numbers after that. Whereas a multi-conductor cable similarly has the UL designation, but there's usually a 2 in front of that or something similar. But by and large, these UL approved wires and cables that we can produce here at Epec cover the gambit of dozens and dozens of UL ratings, both for bare copper and tinned copper wire. Conductor sizes that we can support typically range from 4 AWG all the way to 40 AWG. And this consists of both solid, stranded, and even ultra high strand counts, as well as a variety of shielding technologies. But overall, to get a UL wire used in one of your builds, the odds are that whatever you need from a design perspective, whether it's a single conductor, multi-conductor, variety of tinning and strand types to different shielding methodologies, the odds are there is a UL wire that we have that can be used in your application. Talking a little bit about the actual cables themselves and what specific parts of the cable are UL. The bulk wire, the main trunk of the cable, is what we're going to focus on today. And that's important because when customers come to us looking for a UL approved wire, it's important to designate to them early in the process whether or not we can use a UL approved bulk wire or if the finished cable needs to be UL approved. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in today's webinar. But for right now, the designation that we're going to focus on is that it's the bulk wire that has that UL rating. A lot of customers ask if we have UL for the overmolds, for the connectors, or the crimp terminals, but the reality is those typically have corresponding flame ratings that then need to be compliant, that we need to be compliant to in order to satisfy that UL. So for example, the overmold material itself does not have UL, however, it has a certain flammability rating. And if that flammability rating violates that of the parent cable, it may undermine the actual UL approval altogether. The same is true for these off-the-shelf connectors. Many of them are built with flame retardant materials. UL 94V0 is the best or most strict of those characterizations there. And many of the connectors that we lean on have that. The crimp terminals, being a metallic conductive part of the cable, they typically don't have the UL approval. However, they are paired with either flame retardant or other UL approved members of the assembly. And the reason that we look at UL wire that we make and why it's so helpful to our customers is because it represents a cost savings. And that cost savings can be significant based on the wire gauge size and the overall length or consumption of that wire. For example, if you're using a 28 gauge single conductor wire and it's maybe 4 or 5 inches long versus a 25-foot 6 conductor 16 or 18 gauge wire, the cost savings, or at least the relative cost savings that we can offer are significant. And as you go through this slide here, the goal of this is to clearly articulate that when Epec can use both our own form, fit, function equivalent connectors paired with our UL approved equivalent wire, we can save our customers a lot of money. This is typically valid for higher production quantities. For the sake of discussion, anything north of 1,000 pieces, this holds true. If you need 6 custom cable assemblies, because of lot chargers and minimum order quantities, it may not make sense to use an equivalent wire or an equivalent connector. And it may actually make sense to use something that's more readily available and off the shelf. But each and every project and situation is different. And that's one of the things that we can do to help our customers get to market faster with less cost and less supply chain risk. So we'll dive in here, talk a little bit about how the actual UL wire is manufactured. So just like any other ordinary electrical harness and wire, this all starts with pelletized raw materials, typically thermoplastics like PVC, TPE, and other materials like that, that are sourced in bulk at our manufacturing locations. These pellets are then ground and warmed and heated and then extrude around long, thin strands of spun copper wire. Depending on the gauge, different amounts of copper are drawn together to give you the exact electrical characteristics and requirements for the given gauge. Once that center conductor is formed, it's drawn through our extrusion machine where the melted thermoplastic is then envelops the center conductor, forming a single conductor wire. These thermoplastics can be colorized. black, red, green, white, yellow with a blue stripe, green with a yellow stripe, and so forth. Each of these represents a completely unique manufacturing process. The goal here for companies like Epec is for us to produce and have enough of both the raw materials, the raw ingredients, and these single conductor wires, so that when our customers come to us looking for a complex multi-conductor wire with different colors, different wire sizes, we have a lot of the raw materials and an existing UL approval to go with that build. Once the raw wire is extruded, sometimes a shield or overbraid is added, and then sometimes additional legs are then spun with the wire, yielding the finished either single conductor or multi-conductor cable. The final step of the process here involves part marking to comply with UL. In order to fully comply with all UL requirements, the UL spec, voltage, and temperature are printed along the circumference of the wire jacket, and then it's spooled into various different sizes and drums depending on the application and where this is being used. I bring up the part marking because this is one of the most vital parts of the process. The reason is, if you look closely on a lot of the wires we make, you can read the actual UL spec. This one shown in the upper left, this is a UL 2517 multi-conductor cable that we used in a custom overmolded harness for our customer. The voltage, the flame rating, and the temperature are all printed along the wire jacket. It's important to note what's printed on here is not necessarily the max requirement or condition that that wire can survive. And what I mean by that is, in this example here, this wire is rated for 300 volts. Does that mean it's going to fail at 350 volts, 400 volts? No, it means that to comply with this UL spec, UL 2517, we must meet the VW-1 flame rating, max operating temperature of 105 degrees C, and then a dielectric breakdown of 300 volts. But what we'll show throughout this webinar today is that there's situations when the wire we produce actually exceeds the UL requirements that are listed and printed. Next, we'll be talking a little bit more about our UL rated wire options and how to apply them. So when we say UL approved bulk wire, what do we exactly mean? We mean quite literally any of these cables shown here can use UL approved wire. It's important to note that all the terminals, the connectors, the housings, the ends of the cable, those don't necessarily have any bearing on the UL because the UL applies to just the bulk cable. This is important because when customers are trying to develop a solution and looking at how to get to market, a lot of times it can get bogged down or there can be confusion over the connector, the overmold used on the connector, and other requirements and how it fits into the overall certification in bringing one of these to market. It's important to take away that any connector used can be paired with a UL wire. And depending on your circumstances and what you're trying to accomplish, these are things that we can certainly help dive in and better understand what you're trying to accomplish. So in addition to both the UL approval that applies to either a single conductor or a multi-conductor wire, there are options to obtain UL for the entire finished cable assembly. This is most commonly done for power cables and other types of safety critical applications. So for example, looking at some of the power cords that may be around your house or your office, if you look carefully at one of the overmolded ends, you may see some really fine print or text that's actually molded into the connector. That information cannot legally be added to the overmold until the UL for that finished completed cable assembly is done. And that's at times a lengthy and expensive process. So for example, we have dozens and dozens and dozens of existing UL approvals for terminated and completed power cables. And what that governs is the material, the connector type, and the wire. What doesn't matter is the color, the overall length, and other variables like that. So it's important to understand where the UL of a finished cable, like a power cable, applies and where it doesn't. But just as we said how these requirements all fit within various UL specs for material, connector type, and such, if you or the customer, your end customer, wants to change one of these things, like for example, if we're using a service cord that's traditionally made of TPE, and because of the application, you're trying to use this in a setting where you must use a TPU or another thermoplastic, we cannot certify to UL without going through and actually going and performing those third-party tests. Some of these can take a few months and cost tens of thousands of dollars, depending on what's involved. So circling back to the actual wire options that we can support for more discrete and traditional hookup wires, it really runs the gamut. As I said before, it covers both single and multi-conductor wires, a variety of shielding options, but more importantly, depending on your application and what your requirements are for voltage and temperature, we have numerous UL approved materials that we can use and employ in these custom extrusions. PVC remains one of our most common and the lowest price option for many of our customers. However, PVC does have some limits. It's not the best in terms of high temperature, ultra high voltage, or flexibility. However, it's wildly effective in most of the low complexity and hookup wire applications that we see. Cross-linked polyethylene, Teflon and its derivatives, and even silicone are very common materials for us. So, as I said, PVC is likely our most common and widely used UL wire here. PVC is the primary material used for UL 1007 1569 single conductor wires. This is important because this wire is actually dual certified, meaning both UL specs are printed along the edge of this wire. This actually can create some confusion for customers because it's not clear if this wire will survive 80 degrees C or 105 degrees C. But because of the design of the wire, because of the properties of PVC, this wire is actually dual certified, meaning that it'll survive 105 degrees C, 300 volts, and has a horizontal flame rating. Therefore, it complies with UL 1569. And along those same lines, because it complies with UL 1569, it's also then compliant to UL 1007. This is important because if a customer needs a UL 1007 wire, we can suggest UL 1569 in it. It is form, fit, function, equivalent, and can be used accordingly. Now, taking that UL 1569 wire type and just bundling it with other wires, we can then conform to UL 2464, which is for, it's one of the most common multi-conductor UL specs that we can support. As I said on the previous slide, UL 1569 is rated to 105 degrees C. However, the UL 2464 per UL only needs to survive 80 degrees C. This is an example of how our UL 2464 wire actually surpasses industry standards and expectations. And what we mean by that Even though 80 degrees C may be printed along the wire jacket, because this is using the UL 1569 wire internally, this can actually survive up to 105 degrees C or higher, depending on the application and what we need. Again, expanding the family of PVC wire material options we have, UL 1015 is a higher voltage, higher temperature, single conductor PVC cable that we can offer. This is very similar to the UL 1007 1569 family. However, it has a 600 volt rating. And the way that we can accomplish that is just using a slightly thicker insulation material. And as the thickness of the insulation goes up, the flexibility, unfortunately, will slightly decrease. But this wire is extremely common for grounding wires, bonding wires, and any application where a ring terminal is designed to carry a potentially high current load to ground. Now, taking that single conductor version we just talked about, the UL 1015, and then bundling that with different wires of the same properties, but just different colors, we can produce a UL 2517 multi-conductor cable. Just like the others I've talked about here, these all employ PVC as the wire jacket material. However, these have a voltage rating of up to 600 volts AC and a temperature rating of 105 degrees C. Moving over to ribbon cables or flat cables, this UL spec, UL 2651, is extremely common for us, mostly because there's a whole mess of ribbon cables out there that exist, the majority of which are 24, 26 gauge size wire, but they all typically use some kind of IDC connector, and a lot of them are made by some of the name brand manufacturers. So we can offer our own UL 2651 as a form fit function replacement to many of the ribbon cable specs that are out there. And just like what we talked about earlier, while this UL spec requires that these are certified to 60 degrees C, many of these ribbon cables will survive temperatures far in excess of 60 degrees C, surpassing industry standards for this UL type. It's also important to note that the color of these ribbon cables has no bearing on the UL rating as long as the UL is printed along the wire jacket. So for example, most of our customers require just a gray wire jacket, and typically the pin 1 leg is color-coded red. However, other customers may require multicolor or rainbow type color conductors to conform with whatever pinout or requirements that they need. Looking at some of the other additional UL wire types that we can support, it's not just PVC. As I said previously, there's cross-linked polyethylene, Teflon families, which is both PTFE and FEP, as well as silicone. These are all somewhat exotic materials and have different requirements in terms of minimum order quantities and how they're batch processed. UL 1061, shown at the top here, is actually a semi-rigid PVC, which is a nice option for us to consider because it's a thinner wire jacket compared to the more traditional PVC UL specs we talked about. It's also a material type that doesn't have the extreme minimum order quantities because of how it's made. So where some of these Teflon and silicone type materials may have a few thousand linear feet, up to 10,000 linear feet minimum runs, The semi-rigid PVC UL 1061 we can support in much, much smaller runs because of how it's made and the complexities involved. We talked a little bit about service cords and power cords and how we can obtain UL on the finished product, but that's a lot easier if we're using an existing UL approved service cord. If you look around your house, maybe find an old extension cord, read what's printed along the perimeter of that wire jacket. The odds are you're going to see one of these classifications, whether it's SOOW, SJOOW, SJEOOW. Each one of these has a very specific designation, with S meaning service cord, with the O being oil or moisture resistance, and the J signifying a junior level, which is basically a lower voltage threshold. But the majority of these all use TPE, also known as thermoplastic elastomer, which is an extremely common material in the extrusion of bulk wire. TPE has excellent voltage breakdown strength. It's highly manufacturable. And when it's molded correctly, you can actually regrind the wasted material and reuse that depending on the application. One other note I wanted to make is a lot of our military and aerospace customers use specialty wire that has extremely high minimum order quantities, many of which have silver-plated copper conductors. Many of them have ultra-thin insulation and jackets. A lot of them use Teflon, FEP, and other exotic materials. However, there still remains a tremendous amount of lower tech and lower complexity wires that are used in mil-spec applications. UL 1015 is an example of how there is an actual mil-spec M16878/1 type B, which calls out a single conductor, stranded tinned wire with PVC insulation, 600 volt rating up to 105 degrees C. Those requirements fall within that mil spec and therefore comply with UL 1015. This is important for our warfighters and our other military customers who are developing box builds and other equipment that don't need the ultra high performance of a Teflon jacket, who don't need the extremely high voltage rating of other types of custom extrusions. And they can just use the more traditional PVC wire that's low cost and readily available. So for applications like this, we can actually use our own UL 1015 wire that is then compliant to many of the mil specs. At the end of the day, we, Epec, are not the ones who have design authority for many of your projects. That's you, our customer. So if this is something that you'd like to consider, we can help you and better understand the specifics involved, the performance characteristics, but we're not the ones that are able to certify that we can use UL 1015 in your application. That's typically you or your end customer who may have design authority. But there are options for us if you do have some of these lower complexity mil-spec wires. Next, we'll be talking more about custom designs using UL wire and diving into some situations where a non-UL wire makes sense. So focusing on the actual UL requirements themselves, this listing is direct from UL, and what it covers is the flat cable or ribbon cable that we talked a bit about a few slides back. This is for UL 2561. And the listing here demonstrates that to comply with UL 2561, you need to survive the 60°C temperature requirement, a 300 volt AC dielectric breakdown, and then a horizontal flame test. This also requires that the center conductor ranges either from 16 gauge to 26 gauge. All of this has to be done with an extruded PVC jacket with the thickness defined here between 40 and 50 mils. But it's important here to know that you can use this wire and use it in an application that may be higher temperature or higher voltage, given that we know some of these PVC wires can survive 80 degrees C, even 105 degrees C. So depending on what you're trying to do, it may be appropriate to use an ordinary UL wire and use it in a situation that surpasses that industry standard that UL is called out here. If that's the case, we strongly suggest to test, plan for samples, and plan for an opportunity to make certain that that UL particular wire will survive in the end application you're going to use it. In terms of custom extrusion options, really the sky's the limit. And what we mean by that is for the UL pages we showed before that had multi-conductor wires, like UL 2464 or UL 2517, these all can include any number of individual conductors. And what we mean by that, if you need 20 twisted pairs all within one bundle, UL will comply that, or we can make that using the existing UL process we have, as long as we can print the UL marking on the wire jacket, as long as we're using PVC that can survive either 80 degrees C or 105 degrees C, and then we can certify that this cable will survive the 300 volt or 600 volt requirement as noted. What UL does not define is whether or not these are single conductors, twisted pairs, triads, individually shielded pairs. Any of those can be done and still comply within the parent UL spec, like UL 2464 and UL 2517. It's also important to note, as we go further and further into the customization, some of the things our end customers may be asking us to do can actually violate that UL. That is something that we will have a conversation with you about and try to give you options to better understand what you're trying to accomplish so that we can advise you on the best way to proceed. Depending on what you're trying to accomplish, if you need a custom wire extrusion and you have enough usage, like 1,000 linear feet or 10,000 linear feet, we can extrude our own UL approved custom extrusions in less than 3 weeks' time. So now moving over to non-UL wire options and unpacking what exactly that means. So some of our customers that are building cables that are used in an application where cosmetics are important or branding or any number of requirements, there are situations where our customer explains that they don't want any printed wire jacket or any printed markings along the wire jacket. So these headphone cables up in the upper right, they're made of white PVC, but what you can see is that there's no printing along the wire jacket here. A lot of our customers will define this and clearly state that no markings shall be on the exterior of the jacket. And in some situations, our customers will also say that we need to use a UL 2464 wire. That directly violates UL. We cannot support that. The best way to manage that is to review the application to see really what the customer is trying to do and why they're trying to do it. We can make any custom extrusion you want, with the markings, without the markings. But whatever we're doing, it needs to ultimately satisfy the end project objectives. Biocompatibility is another concern for our customers. There may be situations where our customer says, we need you to use a biocompatible UL 2517 wire. That is not possible. And the reason is A lot of the materials added for flame retardancy and other materials and compounds added to meet whatever flammability requirement, those can actually violate the biocompatibility rating of the cable. So in order to comply with a fully biocompatible material, many times we have to abandon the UL of that. It doesn't mean we totally throw all that out the window. Our customers can define the performance of a UL wire and then give us the approval to make it in a non-UL fashion, but with biocompatible material. This is also true for the overmold materials used in the connectors. If you're using a biocompatible wire jacket, we're going to want to use a similar or the exact same overmold material so that it can chemically bond and give you a proper seal between the wire jacket and overmold. At the end of the day, any of these requirements that our customer asks us to change that violate UL will trigger some comments or discussion with our technical team and you, the customer. We want to make sure it's clear to you and the certification bodies that you're working with that if UL is required, we must be fully compliant with all regards to the UL spec in terms of part marking, flammability, voltage threshold, and temperature performance. Next, we'll talk about some options about what to do to get started with your custom build. So before getting too far into any cable design project, we want to work with you and understand what the industry that you're targeting is, and if there's any approvals that are needed to bring this to market. It's also important to note wherever this is sold may drive what UL and what testing is required in terms of a initial certification. So for example, there's CSA specifications that we need to comply with that are needed to sell a certain product in Canada. Versus there's other UL requirements that we may or may not have that give the approval to be sold in the US or other places in the world. But overall, the goal here is to get a firm grasp on what the overall system requirements are for the end product. Having a conversation with our technical team and our sales team will help us better understand what's involved to bring one of these to market. The best way to move forward with this is to start by filling out one of our custom cable assembly inquiry forms. This is something that our technical team and our sales team can work with you on. And the goal here is to provide an accurate, quick snapshot of your overall program needs that gives us a head start to better understand what you're trying to accomplish and recommend appropriate solutions. Next, talk a bit about what we've just covered today in our summary. So, as we said, there's dozens and dozens of existing UL wires that we have existing approval for that may work for your end application. Most of the name brand wires you're probably using today have this UL approval, many of which we also do with an existing UL approval through Epec. These UL rated wires can be completely customized to your application. This means changing the wire gauge size, the color, overall length, strand count, conductor count, etc. All of these don't violate UL. However, other things like omitting part markings, wire markings, and biocompatibility can all violate the UL ratings because they'll either undermine the part marking spec of UL or the flammability rating. We also touched on the power cables that can be UL certified as a whole. However, those can be expensive and take several months to complete. But if that's something that's needed to bring your product to market, it's absolutely something that we can help guide you on. Next, I'm going to kick it over to Ryan to talk a little bit about our products.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll reviews the questions that came in. I want to briefly mention some of the additional products we offer here at Epec. For more than 70 years, Epec has designed and manufactured custom build-to-print electronics. Our expertise not only lies in custom cable assemblies, but also custom battery packs, printed circuit boards, flex and rigid flex PCBs, CNC machining through our sister company Metalcraft Machining, high reliability user interfaces, flexible heaters, and energy efficient fans and motors. Next slide, please. Now I'll turn it back over to Stephen to go through some of the questions that came in.
Thank you, Ryan. First question here. Does UL cover multi-conductor cables but with different AWG sizes? Yes, absolutely. What I understand this question to be is a situation where you may have 3 or 4 data or communication lines. Maybe those are 24 to 26 gauge, and then you have 2 power lines that are maybe 14 or 16 gauge. So yes, the UL multi-conductor specs that we have would be fully compliant with a situation like this. And this is actually pretty common for customers who are looking to bundle power and data within one cable. This is actually very similar to a traditional USB cable, a 4-wire traditional USB cable where 2 of the legs are power and usually larger size, and 2 of the other legs are usually just data or communication and typically smaller or thinner. Next question, can we add our company name and logo to the wire jacket and still satisfy the UL requirements? So one of the issues we run into here is when a customer wants to take and completely strip out all the part markings and only have their company logo or their brand. This would violate UL. Per UL, we have to have the UL number itself, the flammability rating, temperature, voltage, etc. So those must be there. If we can have those and a customer name or something, then we will be fully compliant with UL. However, if it needs to be an all white jacket with just your company logo or your branding information printed along the wire, that is not something that would then comply with UL. Next question reads, my company prefers to buy wire in 100-foot rolls. Do you sell this wire in 100-foot spool form? Yes, absolutely. We can completely customize how this wire is made. Some of our customers will source this from us in 1,000-foot spools. Some customers will source this from us in 100-foot spools, just like the way you'd buy it on DigiKey or Mauser. So it really depends, but that's something that we want to work with you on, because since we are a completely custom shop, everything we do is driven by your needs and your requirements. What's the most inexpensive UL rated wire you can offer? I did mention this at the beginning. That would be our standard PVC UL wire. Typically, those are the single conductors to the tune of UL 1007 or 1569. So typically, anything that's going to be PVC based is our best and lowest cost option for you to consider. Last question we can take here is, we need UL on our product. Can we use your wire in this build to satisfy the testing Intertech is doing? Absolutely. I think actually employing UL wire in your build or in your kit is actually the preferred way, and something that these third-party testing companies like Intertech are going to look for. So submitting the paperwork, the bill of materials, and all the information for a company like Intertech, if we're using existing UL approved wire, that just makes things that much easier and decreases several types of testing and requirements that would need to be performed to bring a product like that to market. So I guess the answer to this one here would be, yes, you can use our wire, and actually it's preferred to use UL wire if you are trying to send this through some third-party accreditation company. That is all the time we have. I wanted to thank you for joining our webinar today. If you have any questions, please email us at sales@epectech.com or come check out our website at www.epectech.com. Thanks again and have a great afternoon.